Okay, this is the Chapter 20 outline for AP US History. This chapter is called Big Business and Organized Labor. So from 1869 to 1899, America was becoming an industrial and agricultural giant. The population tripled, farm production doubled, the value of manufacturers multiplied by 6, and it became a rural nation to an industrial nation. So the rise of big businesses. The Industrial Revolution led to huge corporations that dominated economic, political, and social life. And all these businesses grew by owners who wanted to put all production and industrial and distribution processes in single companies. There are a lot of mergers, and some reasons for growth include the immense amount of natural resources in America, including forests, minerals, rivers, and people. Labor-saving machines, so they didn't have to hire as many people. Mass production techniques spreading out into different states. Standardized machineries and standardized parts. Innovative leadership. The Civil War North was pro-business, so therefore there were a lot of tariffs on foreign goods. So after the Civil War, the North was still in power, so they were very pro-business, so a lot of businesses got a really good head start with that. There are a lot of land grants to railroads. The Homestead Act of 1862, which was distributing land to farmers out west. Okay, so the Second Industrial Revolution. Well, first let's review the First Industrial Revolution. The first one began in Britain in the late 1700s. Some major inventions were the coal-powered steam engine, textile machines, that worked with thread and cloth, and the blast furnaces, which made iron, and this is basically the start of factories. Okay, so now let's look at the Second Industrial Revolution, which started in the United States and Germany. Some of the main things about it were the interconnected national transportation and communication, which was the Transcontinental Railroad, and telegraphs and steamships, and so all these different ways of communication and transportation helped, and they actually set an undersea telegraph cable across the Atlantic, which allowed America and Europe to telegraph each other. Electricity was discovered, and this helped industrial machines and urban growth because you can now travel with electric trolleys and subways. Steel production and chemicals. The systematic application of scientific research to industrial processes, such as refining kerosene and gasoline from crude oil, steel production, telephones, typewriters, sewing machines, cameras, elevators, and farm machinery. Building the Transcontinental Railroad, which was basically the main thing. Like when you think Second Industrial Revolution, you should think Transcontinental Railroad. So railroads created an interconnected national market. They helped businesses because the railroads needed iron, steel, and lumber. So the Transcontinental Railroad helped businesses by buying those things. And the South, during the Civil War, their tracks were destroyed, but those were rebuilt. And most of the tracks were built towards the west of the Mississippi River. And the tracks went everywhere. They went through mountains, rivers, canyons, and plains, and there are a lot of government loans involved in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And pre-Civil War, there was pretty much the North versus South Railroad dispute, which was basically like, where should we build the Transcontinental Railroad, in the North or the South? And obviously the North wanted it built in the North, and the South in the South. But then the South secedes, so then the Pacific Railroads Act was signed by Lincoln in 1862, which allowed Transcontinental Railroad to be built in the North. Here's just a little map. Pretend that thing is the United States. This outline right here is the United States. So there were two companies that were working to build the Transcontinental Railroad. There was the Central Pacific Railroad Company, and that started in Sacramento, California. And here's the Union Pacific Railroad, and that started in Omaha, Nebraska. And the railroad companies used U.S. troops to subdue Indians who were in the way. So there were a lot of Indian wars. Okay, so the Union Pacific employees who were on the East Coast or in Omaha, Nebraska were ex-Union or Confederate soldiers, which makes sense because all of them would be on the East Coast because that's where Civil War was fought. Former slaves because slaves were from the South on the East Coast, and Irish and German immigrants who were coming from Europe and landing on the East Coast. Then the Union Pacific. But the Union Pacific had a lot of problems. Like, they had to go through bad roads, there were a lot of water shortages, extreme weather conditions, and Indian attacks, and accidents and injuries. So now let's talk about the Central Pacific and their employees. They were mostly Chinese because they're on the West Coast, so the Chinese are going to immigrate to the West Coast. And they came to America because of the gold rush and because they heard about the railroad jobs. They were willing to do work for low pay because there was low pay in China. Plus, they knew they were going to move back home soon once they got enough money to buy some land back in China, so that way their families could have a better life. And there were a lot of reasons for delay for the Transcontinental Railroad. Like, iron prices were skyrocketing. There were a lot of Indian raids. There were a lot of blizzards. They had to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains. In the end, the Union Pacific had 1,086 miles of railroad. The Central Pacific, 689 miles of railroad. And then the Golden Spike, which is the spike that brought the two railroads together in Promontory, Utah, on May 10th, 1869. And it was put in by Leland Stanford, who was a former California governor. Okay, so now once the first Transcontinental Railroad from Sacramento to Omaha was built, they're like, you know what, we should build a lot more. So they built the second Transcontinental Railroad, which was the Southern Pacific Railroad, and it went through Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe, and Needles. And so it was basically the Transcontinental Railroad for the South. We have the third Transcontinental Railroad, which was the Northern Pacific, which linked Lake Superior to Oregon. And there's the fourth Transcontinental Railroad, which was known as the Great Northern Railroad, and it linked Minnesota to Washington. And I really suggest you go look at page 792. There's a map of all these railroads. I think it's really good. You should definitely look at that just for like 30 seconds. Okay, so financing the railroad, a lot of private companies financed the railroads, and these private companies sold bonds to the American government and foreign investors. Until 1850, debates on federal aid, there were debates on whether or not the federal government can aid or give money for internal improvements, but then in 1850 they said that they could. They gave 129 million acres in land grants, and the railroads were also funded by state and local governments, and the American government got most of its investments back, which is a good thing. That means that it was a good investment. And as towns popped up, government land prices went up, because that's a supply and demand thing, because before there was a lot of land, so there was a lot of supply, and there weren't many people out there, so the demand was low, which means that prices are going to be low. But now there's a large supply, but there's an even greater demand, so the prices went up. Okay. And also another perk for the government was they got discounts on using the railroads. They either got half off on railroads or they got to use them for free. The railroad meant there were going to be economic growth, which means that there were higher government tax revenues, so another perk for the American government. But building the railroads was very corrupt, and the leaders of the railroad companies were called robber barons. And an example of this is the Credit Mobilier, and this was a company that charged $94 million for a $44 million project. So you can see they're very corrupt, and they just wanted money. Jay Gould, what he did was he took old railroads and made them new, and he sold them. He was just really, really corrupt with how he did this, and he was really rich. Another robber baron was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was rich before the Civil War, and he was originally in sea transportation, like boats and stuff, but then he went to land transportation, and he just kept buying railroads. So he got even more rich from that, and he only cared about making a profit for himself. He didn't care about anything else. The same thing with Jay Gould. Invention, spur manufacturing. So after the Civil War, there were a lot more patents, and new technology meant that there was greater productivity with steel making, oil refining, and the refrigerated rail car came about, which allowed them to transport meat, which started the packing business or the packing enterprise. They also had flour milling. They also invented barbed wire, farm tools, George Washington's air brake for trains, steam turbines, the typewriter, vacuum, internal combustion engine, and motion picture. Electricity also came about in the Second Industrial Revolution, which obviously provided power. It also helped with communication with the telephone, which was invented by Alexander Graham Bell, but then was perfected by Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison also invented the phonograph and the light bulb, and the thing with the light bulb was that the source for the energy could only reach 2 miles, so so George Westinghouse invented the alternating current motor, which are those little transformer things that you see pretty much everywhere, which takes all this energy and then it kind of condenses it into there, and it allows us to use lights and stuff. Okay, entrepreneurs. So there's Rockefeller and the Oil Trust, and Rockefeller he really focused on systematic organization and self-discipline, precision, order, and tidiness. And in the Pennsylvania oil rush of 1860, they discovered how to refine kerosene. So Rockefeller started the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, and what they did was they wanted to get rid of all other businesses, all other refinery businesses. So they refined too much oil, they lowered their prices, and therefore they lowered their profit, but other businesses couldn't keep up with the lower competition, so those other businesses would go out of business, or Rockefeller would offer to buy them, and he pretty much got all of the oil refining businesses out except for a few. And he focused on vertical integration, which basically he didn't want to rely on anyone else for anything, so he produced his own barrels and cans. So instead of having to buy barrels and cans from someone else, he owned the barrel and can industry, so he could transport his oil for cheaper. Okay, they had large cash reserves, which meant they were independent of banks in case there was like an economic crisis. And he persuaded railroads to not serve his competitors because he was supplying oil to the railroads. And so he said, you know what, we're going to stop supplying oil if you keep transporting oil from other people. And so they're like, okay, you know what, yeah, we'll stop supplying them. So that's another way he got the other businesses out of business. And the businesses that were still in business, to get rid of them, he started the Standard Oil Trust, which basically there was a board of directors made by all of the Standard Oil companies, and so he basically took all these businesses and put them under one board of directors, and this board of directors was the presidents of all these oil companies, and it was basically a monopoly. And so the Supreme Court said it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, and so they dissolved the trust. And the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was set up then because they were like, oh, you know what, they can't do anything to us if we have this, because what it did was it held stocks in the former Standard Oil Trust companies. So it was basically the same exact thing, except it was with a free market. And so they were only a little bit vulnerable, but they were still vulnerable to the Sherman Antitrust Act. But that pretty much kept them safe. And Rockefeller gave a lot of money to education and medicine. He was a big philanthropist. He donated $500 million throughout his life. Okay, so next entrepreneur would be Carnegie in the steel industry. And just something real quick, both Rockefeller and Carnegie were very poor, and they made their way up from rags to riches. So they developed Carnegie developed a military telegraph system. Then he kept doing different stuff like bridge building and railroads. Then finally he got to his big thing, steel and investments. And the thing that allowed him to create his business, or his steel monopoly, was the Bessemer process, which made crude oil through a blast furnace, or it refined the crude oil in a crude iron in a blast furnace. So he did the same thing with steel, and so he could sell steel for really cheap. One of the things he specialized in was hiring experts, so he didn't really know a lot about the steel process, but he hired people who knew a lot, which was kind of innovative at the time, I guess. And during the recession, he bought out other companies, and because there were a lot of recessions during this time, and the book is just kind of like, oh yeah, so in this recession, in this depression, you're like, oh, okay. But anyway, so there were 1,700 libraries that he donated money to. He also donated money to hospitals and music halls. I'm sure we've all heard of Carnegie Music Hall. Okay, J.P. Morgan, financier. He was born into wealth, unlike Rockefeller and Carnegie. He started J.P. Morgan Company. He bought stocks low and sold them high. And he bought and organized lots of railroads, so he just kept buying and buying stuff. And he actually eventually bought out Carnegie, and he bought out Rockefeller's iron ore industry. So he didn't, because Rockefeller was in oil, but he still had some iron ore, and that got bought out. And he started the United States Steel Corporation. Okay, Sears and Roebuck and Company. So Aaron Montgomery Ward started using mail for selling goods, so it's kind of like how we order stuff online. What he did was, and then it gets mailed to us, he sent out catalogs, and he was like, yes, send us what you want with a check, and then we'll send you the thing. But Sears and Roebuck and Company kind of took over this industry. They had a catalog of 786 pages of just stuff you could buy, and it allowed rural people to buy goods that were normally only available to people who lived in cities. And the way that they got their goods so cheap was by the way that Sears and Roebuck were able to sell goods so cheap, because they bought in mass, which reduced the price, and there was no middleman now. They didn't have to send it to someone who would walk on foot or something. They would just send it through the mail. Or they would ride the train, but now they can just send it through mail on the train. Okay, labor conditions and organization, social trends. So there was a big class difference. There were very few rich people that held the majority of the wealth, and there were a lot of poor people who held the minority of the wealth. There was a high demand for unskilled workers, though, and a lot of these unskilled workers came in as immigrants, women, and children. There were a lot of bad working conditions, like low wages, long hours, and dangerous conditions, and the death and accident rate was skyrocketing. And one of the things about that kind of started to almost like screw things over was that ownership was starting to be separate from management. So instead of the owner of the company managing things, they hired someone else to manage things. And factories were now becoming more machine dependent. Okay, so child labor. 1/6 of children worked during the time, and they did this to help support their family. And there were over 2 million child laborers. They didn't receive an education. There were some child labor laws, but they were generally ignored. So now we're starting to see some disorganized protests that's going to eventually lead into huge strikes in labor unions. But, so a lot of the workforce were immigrants, and they obviously couldn't organize themselves because they all spoke different languages. And there were some strikes in response to wage cuts, and there were 3 big strikes. Now we're going to talk about the 3 big strikes. The first was the Molly Maguire strike. They were Irish workers, and they wanted to fight against the dangerous working conditions in mines, and they used terrorism to right injustices against the Irish workers. And so the owner of the mining company sent in spies and found out who the leaders of the Molly Maguires were, and they hung or fired the leaders. And since they learned about the Molly Maguires, they're like, you know what, like, you guys don't trust us, like, so to punish you, we're going to reduce wages. And they also dissolved the Miners' National Association. The railroad strike of 1877. So there's a financial panic of 1875, which the book just kind of throws in there, like I said before, in which East railroads they cut wages, and West Virginian workers walked off the jobs and blocked the tracks. And so this was a disorganized, but they were disorganized, but they created a mob. And so this inspired strikes all over the country. So a lot of railroad workers were now just stopping and turning into mobs. And so militias had to be sent in to subdue the strikes. There were a lot of deaths and properties destroyed, but eventually the strike just failed. Okay. The Sandlot incident. This was basically, there were anti-Chinese riots in California. And in the Depression of the 1870s, just another random depression that they throw in. they blamed the Chinese. They used them as scapegoats. They were like, oh, this is all their fault because the Chinese are taking the white man's jobs. And so they set up the Working Man's Party of California, which wanted to end Chinese immigration. They got a bill passed in Congress to end Chinese immigration, but the party was soon dissolved, but the law still was there. Okay, moving towards permanent unions. There are already unions for skilled laborers, and there's the National Labor Union, which focused on labor reform instead of negotiations with employers. So what they did was they fought for 8-hour workdays for federal employees, payment in greenbacks, equal rights for women and African Americans, repeal of the 1864 Contract Labor Act. And the Contract Labor Act said that employers could pay for immigrants to come over to America and then hire them for it. And it was basically like indentured servitude. But then the Foreign Act of 1885, which is right here, kind of, we'll see that later in like 30 seconds. But they did repeal the 1864 Contract Labor Act with that Foreign Act of 1889, I think that is. 1885. Okay. So the Knights of Labor was this huge union party, but they used secrecy to protect their members from employers. They wanted creation of bureaus of labor statistics and mechanics lien laws to ensure payment of salaries, because a lot of times people get gypped out of their salaries. They wanted elimination of convict labor competition. They wanted an 8-hour workday, which they got. See how there's a check mark next to it, and here there's a check mark against the repeal of the 1864 Contract Labor Law. They wanted to be paid in paper currency or greenbacks, and they wanted equal pay for men and women. They preferred boycotts to strikes, and they were a union of skilled and unskilled workers, which was kind of rare at the time, and they dissolved after the failure of the railroad strike. But the Knights of Labor are the ones who passed the Foreign Act of 1885. They're the ones who really pushed it. Okay, anarchism, the book kind of just throws this in there, and it doesn't really make any sense, but the anarchists believe that the government is controlled by the rich, and they're trying to suppress the working class, so basically just saying that anarchists were pro-union, so there was a bit of support for unions there. Okay, the Haymarket Affair, so the Knights of Labor, they were at one of their factories, or a factory where a lot of their members worked. They set an 8-hour workday ultimatum. They said, you know what, you have to give us an 8-hour workday by this date, or we're going to go on strike. And so that condition wasn't met, so they went on strike. And so then there was like this whole like mob scene that happened. So the policeman killed a striker, and there was lots of fighting, and someone threw a bomb at the police. And so they're kind of unclear if someone threw the bomb and then the police shot, or if the police shot and then someone threw the bomb. But it was connected with the Knights of Labor, and so this helped end the Knights of Labor because it kind of got a bad name after this. Okay, Gompers and the American Federation of Labor. So skilled workers unions opposed industrial unionism. They were like, you know what, only craft labor or craft unions should be unions, and craft unions are unions of skilled laborers. And so the American Federation of Labor was made up of only craft unions, and the president's name was Samuel Gompers, and he focused on higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions, just like everyone else. He didn't focus on politics, though. He was just like, you know what, we're going for this. I don't care about political parties. Just these 3 things are what I want. And he started closed shops, which were shops that could shops that could only hire union members. And then there were also union preference shops, which can only hire non-union members if there are no union members left to be hired. And they waged strikes a lot, and there were some unskilled workers unions in the American Federation of Labor, but there weren't a lot. Okay, the Homestead strike. So Andrew Carnegie basically sympathized with the unions. He was like, okay, I'll give you like the better working conditions, shorter hours, and stuff like that. But then when Henry Clay Frick became the president of Carnegie Steel, he couldn't come to an agreement with the workers on the new contract. So there was a strike / a lockout. Like, they were gonna go on strike, but then he was like, too bad, I'm locking you out. So they were just kind of standing there. And so Frick hired 300 Pinkerton detectives. I don't know what a Pinkerton detective is, by the way. They just kind of throw it in there, like everything. And and he put up a 12-foot fence around the factory so no one could get in. And there was a 14-hour gun battle along on the shore with the Pinkertons and the workers. And so the Pinkertons eventually surrendered. But then state militia was sent in, and Frick hired strikebreakers, which were temporary workers, while the state militia was getting everything done. So Frick could still have Carnegie Steel, like, producing steel. But the strike ended, and only 1/5 of those who went on strike were hired back. Only like 3 more pages, I think. So the business won in that case. Okay, the Pullman strike, this started in Pullman, Illinois, and it went across 27 states. And what happened was the Pullman Palace Car Company produced railroad cars, and I said their workers lived on campus, and basically they had to live right next to the factory. They had to pay utility bills, rents, and they could only buy goods on campus, which was like the factory campus. And so one day, the leader of the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages and laid off 3,000 of his 5,800 employees, but he didn't lower the rent, utility, or goods cost. And he also fired 3 members of the Workers' Grievance Committee. And so all these Pullman workers went on strike, but they were kind of small, so nothing really happened. So the American Railway Union, who was also pro-union, decided to team up with them. And so they stopped handling the Pullman railroad cars, and so this stopped most of the Midwest rail cars because most of those were Pullman cars. So what they did was the railroad companies hired strikebreakers to connect Pullman cars to Federal mail cars. So then the government had to send in militiamen and deputies to keep the railroad cars running because now the strike was interfering with the government. And just a little fact, the strikebreakers were called scabs, and strikebreakers are the people who are hired during a strike to keep production going. And President Grover Cleveland, since he knew this was interfering with the mail now because the Pullman cars were attached to the mail cars, he sent in federal troops to work the trains, and then the Supreme Court said that this strike violated the Sherman Antitrust Act because they're such a big union and they're acting like a monopoly controlling the whole railroad industry. So that stopped the strike. Hey, Mother Jones was a working class activist. She gave speeches to businesses and police talking about how terrible they were and how they should get better working conditions. She joined the Knights of Labor and the United Mine Workers. She was a member of the Socialist Party, and she wanted shorter hours, higher wages, child working laws, and better conditions, and she kind of got these things. But her main thing was working on child labor laws, and she led a child labor march to Theodore Roosevelt's house. Okay, socialism and the Union. So American unions did not become allies with socialists, unlike the Europeans. So the European unions were best friends with the socialists. They were pretty much one and the same, but America kind of separated them. So then we have the Socialist Labor Party, which focused on Marxism. They were very pro-union, and most of their members were from Germany. And their leader was Daniel Deloigne, and he wanted to build a powerful political party, have this political party take over the government. And then once they took over the government, they would take down the government and make union leaders government officials. And then we have the Social Democratic Party. Sorry, you guys, that this part of the outline is kind of messed up. But we have the Social Democratic Party, who was led by Eugene Debs. And he ran for president, and I have a small smiley face there because he got a pretty good amount of votes. He didn't win, but he got a pretty good amount of votes. And then, so these two parties combined into the Socialist Party of America. So it was combined with the Socialist Labor Party and the Social Democratic Party. And this helped them do better in the presidential elections, but they still didn't win. But they got 33 cities with socialist mayors, which is pretty successful. But they fell due to conflicts over whether or not America should join World War I and the emergence of the Communist Party, which took a lot of socialist members and moved it into the Communist Party. Okay. The Wobblies, these were industrial workers of the world, or IWW, and their nickname was the Wobblies. They were pro-union, and they were made up mostly of the Western Federation of Miners, and they wanted skilled and unskilled workers. They hated all the unions that only wanted skilled workers. These were called craft unions. And their main thing was syndicalism, which was basically the destruction of government and replacing by unions, which is pretty much what the socialists wanted. They were led by a guy named Haywood, but there were a lot of disputes among the board of leaders, and they had very few victories, and their members weren't very good. They were known as anarchists, bums, and criminals, and they were mostly immigrants. And, oh, that's it. So that's that chapter. I think it's chapter 20.